Thank you, and I'm very sorry for that short story. Thank you all for coming. It's lovely to be here, and it's very lovely to be here with the authors of these two wonderful novels. What I'm going to do, I know that Anne-Marie already briefly quoted from a review of Colin's novel, but I'm going to quote briefly from reviews of both of these novels to give you a sort of sense of what these books are about. And then I'm going to ask each of these writers to read a very short excerpt from their books, again, to give you all a sense of these two wonderful books, because my job here today is to get each and every one of you to go out and buy these books, not because they're paying me to say that, but because I would say it anyway, because they are wonderful novels. Also, they're not paying me anything as far as I'm aware. I'm going to quote from the review of Colin's novel first, which this appeared in the Irish Times. It's very bad form to quote yourself, but I did write this. So forgive me. You could do worse, our reviewer wrote. Then quote some of Barrett's small miracles of precision, some of them taking the form of a single word. Quote, a wind kicking in off the river to twice dash the flame of Flynn's lighter, where dash is the minor miracle. Or, quote, the jangling dentition of crockery crowding the upper rack of a kitchen cupboard, where dentition is just the right side of fussy, its potential fussiness redeemed by the alliteration of crockery crowding and by the carefully modulated vowel sounds distributed through the rest of the phrase. Actually, slightly fussy review, that, but there you go. I quote this because this is one of the miracles of this book is its prose, and in both of these novels are novels that pay incredibly close attention to language in their various ways, and it's something I want to talk about in a moment. I also want to quote from, this is not me this time, this is from Barney Norris reviewing Estelle's Ravelling for The Guardian. He wrote, quote, Estelle Birdy's debut is a sprawling social novel that aims squarely at capturing the lives of a group of boys becoming men in working-class Dublin. Ravelling charts the year when Dino, Carl, Oisin, Bennett and Hamza prepared to take the leaving, as they all refer to their leaving certificate. In one of a profusion of beautifully poetic dialectical noticings Birdy crams into her story. Her work has been compared to Roddy Doyle, who shares her pleasure in documenting the Dublin dialect, but the artist who comes most strongly to mind is Richard Linklater, whose films showcase similar moments in young lives through multiple protagonist narratives. So hope that gives you some sense of what these two novels are about and what they're doing. I'm going to hand over now. Maybe Colin would be willing to begin and read us a few pages from Wild Houses. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And I'll just read a couple of pages to give you a very brief taste of it. The novel basically pivots around a kidnapping of sorts. And so this section here features one of the two main characters, Dev, one of the two prospective characters. His house, he's sort of, two people he knows have kidnapped someone and brought them to his house, a teenage boy, so he wasn't really a willing participant in this. He's a passive accomplice. So this is the morning after the night before when his cousins showed up with this young kid they kidnapped. Dev woke up looking at the ceiling. His neck felt like someone had tried to axe it off in his sleep. When he slept, his head lurched around and settled at acute angles. The pill he took made him groggy, but the sleep that followed was thin and turbulent, punctuated by obscure surgings of his pulse. He often woke, as now, exhausted, his heart drumming and cold coins of sweat pushing through his pores. Dev hauled himself onto his elbow and swung his feet out onto the floor. His eyes stung like he'd been in water. He rubbed them and stretched his brittle neck side to side, the muscles gristling as he worked the sharp stiffness out. His t-shirt was damp, tacked to his shoulder blades. Already he had a headache. He groped around, found his phone in the folds of his blanket. It was just after 6 a.m. He'd barely slept, but he was wide awake. It felt like it had happened 5 minutes ago. The Ferdias, showing up in the middle of the night, the kid trying to get away, the kid in the basement. Dev felt electrocuted with wakefulness. He went downstairs. Gabe was out cold on the sofa, bare feet on the coffee table and head flung back, his Tequila Patrol jacket draped over his chest like a barber's bib. His socks were balled and wadded into his boots by the sofa, a vile waft coming up off his bloodlessly pale, gnarled feet. Dev went on to the kitchen. The kitchen was how he left it. Dented navy, Corona bottle caps, littering the floor and the kid's runner tossed in a corner. the ceramic specks of the smashed plate, starring the grouting, and the bigger bone-like chunks of it ranged along the skirting board. The kitchen chairs wrenched back and abandoned at stricken angles from the table. The morning sky through the long curtainless window above the sink was as blue and clean as the ring of flame from a gas stove. It looked like the sky of another planet. I'll leave it there now.
Thank you. And Estelle, please read to us from Ravelling. Thank you.
The book is about 5 young fellas, but it's also about the community around them, their families, their other friends, and just Dublin life. And this scene, it's only a little short section of this scene where 2 of the fellas who are best friends, one of them is just coming back to hurling. So they play hurling down at a club in Crumlin, on the Crumlin Road. And he hasn't been there for a while. And so he's just arrived in and he's met his best friend, but he hasn't seen him at hurling for quite a while. So it's Dino and Oisín. What's that you're smoking? Match prep, is it? Tying his laces, Dino puts the rollie in the corner of his mouth. Popeye-like. He turns to look at Oisín. Ah, yeah, it's me protein smoke, you know. Just tobacco, but no green at all this morning. Boys hammered into it last night. Another thing you missed. Going hams is after. Think he has the last of me stuff. Shrooms, though. Oh, man, I swear. I was down at my dad's, I told yous. Drove me up from Carlow this morning. Still ancient, is he? Is he back riding your ma yet, or what? Yep, still ancient, Oisín says, smiling. Better get him off the subject of the ancient dad and his sudden reappearance a few years ago after Rory's accident. The slagging'll be too much. A proper smoke beforehand helps you play better anyway, right, Dino? Dino narrows his eyes, holding out his arm, gesturing towards the playing fields. Helps the calculation of the physication. Know what I mean, bro? Seriously, but why haven't you been here, you lazy cunt, letting your team down? Hurling too rough for you these days, is it, Poshy? Piano or some other fucking gay thing? Opera, is that what you're at? Hold on, studying, is it? Hurling's not the same as school, Dino. It's your leaving, for fuck's sake, Oisín says, kicking the curb. Only a few more months to go. What are you at? You're just lying around playing COD all day. A voice calls from behind Oisín's back. Oi! Oisín looks back at the red-faced man stomping towards them, seriously intending something. Here's the gaffer. You're in for it now, Oisín, bro. What's that I see? Is that a ghost? Hold me back. It's a fucking ghost. All right, Whacker, Oisín says, smiling softly, digging his hurl into the ground. This is great, Oisín. Great, great. Are you back with us, horsebox? Says Whacker, waving a hurl in each hand. Whacker always seems to be bursting out of his skin, like a grilled tomato. A dub, born and raised, played senior county, who speaks with a Kilkenny accent. Aspirations, as someone said. Oisín grins. Weird being called horsebox stops the feeling in his belly. We'll have a good solid team now with Dino here. Benny's already out there. See him there. Been here since early. Up and down that field he is, pucking like a bastard. Whacker gazes towards the perfect hurling human striding up and down the pitch. Wishes we're all like him. Every training session, every match he's here. But sure, you're here now, horsebox, and we'll forget all that. I'll want you midfield now. The pair of yous there, like a couple of Ronaldos, or that fella off Galway.
Thank you. So I hope those readings give you a sense of these 2 books and one of the great joys in reading each of them, which is the language. There is really just extraordinarily inventive, what you might think of as the auditory imagination is one of the major factors in this book, the way we sound and the way language can be made to sound and the way it can be made to address the world. They're really powerful on that level. But I want to talk about the first thing that hits you about each of these books, which is the titles, of course. And I'll start with Colin, and I want to ask, what is A Wild House?
Um,
And have you spent a lot of time in such houses?
There, well, a wild house is already it's something that's already passed in the actual novel. It's referred to in the past. One of the characters' mother says that house is a wild house, and she's referring to the more delinquent of her sons. And I don't know, the phrase just sort of occurred, and in the writing of the book. I mean, houses are very important in this book. Dev, the character there, whose perspective I wrote from, he's a young guy, he's in his early 20s, and he lives alone. His mother recently died. He was very close to her, a very codependent relationship. His father's elsewhere, and he's kind of inherited the house. And because he's someone who's pretty much removed himself from society for reasons that are explained throughout the novel, he's put himself in a place, he's exiled himself. He's not far from, like, part of the kind of joke of the whole thing is, it's a very haphazard, it's a very, not a very sophisticated kidnapping occurs. Basically, a kid is taken about probably 10 or 12 miles from his home. If you don't know where someone is, you don't know where they are. To Dev's house. And Dev's house is not far from Ballinatown, which is in and around where the novel is set, which is an actual town in the west of Ireland. But he has, you know, a wild house is almost it's a spiritual condition. It's a psychic affliction. It's the sort of exile you go to. It's a house that sort of doesn't exist in a sense, or isn't a legible part of the communities, whether it's embedded within them or on the margins, like Dev's house is. So it's just a sort of it's a title we only kind of myself and my editors came up with after we wrote the book, but it did occur. It was, as I often end up doing, I'm stuck looking for a title, just rereading the book or the story, whatever it is, and you'll find a phrase in there, you know. And you talked a lot about you mentioned, Kevin, about, like, you know, as all writers do, you pay a lot of attention to language. You try and make it sound as interesting and to the reader as possible. But yeah, sometimes these little phrases come up and they have a resonance that's not apparent when they drop casually. If you try to wrench them out of yourself in a premeditated fashion, it somehow doesn't work. So it's often those things that just arrive. I didn't remember I used the phrase, and it's not, I mean, I don't know if I've made up the phrase. I think my mother is the actual originator of the phrase. If anyone's ever said it in real life. But yeah, because some people have asked me, is that like a slang term in the west of Ireland or where I'm from? And to my knowledge, it's not. It's just, it was just a phrase that was pulled up out of my conscious when I was writing it.
Yeah, I thought it was a sort of existing slang term, and I thought that the Dublin equivalent of this book would have to be called session gaff.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of it is like there was lots of equivalents, but as far as I know, it's not an actual one. Yeah.
Well, may it enter the language?
Well, it has a resonance. It felt like maybe it should be a term, at least to me. So.
Thank you, Estelle. Why is your novel called Ravelling?
Because I just like the sound of the word ravelling. Can anyone hear me? Everyone hear me?
Lean forward slightly.
Sit forward. Yeah, I just like the sound of the word ravelling. And then I went looking for, I just thought there has to be an opposite to unravelling. And I just love the idea of friendship groups, or just even individuals, but then friendship groups, families, communities, societies, how they, as fabric, coming together, tightening their threads, and then in some other part, something's loosening up. And when I did, actually, long after I had fought for the title, because they were going, I'm not sure about that title. And I said, well, I am sure about that title. So, so long afterwards, I looked it up, and it's a noun as well as a verb. So a ravelling is a piece of kind of pulled thread in something woven. And ravelling can be the opposite of unravelling, but it can also be ravelling, that unravelling, that it's something tearing apart, coming apart. And that was all very apt because the book is very much the sixth main character is really the area, the Liberties, and then more widely Dublin. And so the city is always, and the Liberties is always coming together and falling apart. And then the weaving industry was so big in the Liberties for so long. For a couple of 100 years, it was the world centre of weaving. And there's lots of, relics of that in the name places, in the place names, should I say. Weaver Park that's mentioned there, and the Tenters, the area, and, I wanted to have some of that, the layers of history, the layers of fabric.
Thank you. Fascinating. It really interests me that the first thing you said was that you liked the sound of the word, because this is a novel that you hear as much as you read, I think. And it feels like you've been paying very close attention to the way certain people talk in certain parts of Dublin. I mean, how does that attention operate? Are you making notes in a notebook? Are you writing down phrases that hit your ear and sound good, or is this just a kind of more organic process?
The odd time I would write something down, but no, it's all in my head.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm just listening. I'm just listening to people all the time. Yeah. And I just love the way people speak. I just love it. I just love listening to people speak and say different. I love wild houses, just phrases and funny little quirks in language. So I did study theoretical linguistics, but sociolinguistics was my favourite thing. Accents and how somebody who's grown up with somebody else but has different family members will have slightly different phraseology, and just working that out, that someone will say something slightly differently. I think that's amazing.
It is. Both of these novels are, in a way, about a home place. And I know, Colin, that most of Wild Houses, or possibly all of Wild Houses, was written not in or near Ballina, but in Toronto. What was that experience like of recreating a place you knew well that you couldn't just pop out the door and check?
Yeah. So I did live in Toronto in Canada myself. My family moved there for about 6.5 years, and that's pretty much the time span in which I did write Wild Houses and part of another book as well, Homesickness. And the pandemic happened in the middle of it, so that really, that interrupted even the sort of, you come back once a year, or, maybe twice to Ireland, but that interrupted that too, which made, Ireland as much as the West, I couldn't go there to sort of re-immerse myself, whatever. And it made it, it definitely brought a different energy to it, but I was already, Wild Houses was already very much a memory piece, because as one ages, I was writing about characters who were all teenagers, or most of them in their 20s, a couple of older characters, most of them are that age, whereas I was in my mid to late 30s writing this. I didn't worry too much about fixing it temporally in what exact year it's happening. It's more or less contemporary. It could have happened any time in the last 10 or 15 years, really. And I wanted that kind of fuzziness, I suppose, because I was writing out of my own sort of experiences, and the Mayo I'm writing about, and the landscape, the land I'm writing about, as well as the people are as much artifacts of memory as they are living communities. That tends to be what happens with writing, I think. There's always that gap, Maybe some writers can do it. I find it very hard to metabolize things quickly into a story. So there's always going to be a temporal gap. And so I suppose being away in a very, very different culture. Canada's a very different place. Canadians are profoundly different people to Irish people. yeah, I mean, it made me have to draw inward and draw on a sort of reserve of memory, and sort of had to make me. It sort of, there was an amplified kind of solitude to it. I mean, writing is a solitary pursuit anyway, but it just made it. But that definitely informed the tone of the book. But in one of those sort of like serendipitous processes, I mean, that's the kind of thing I was writing about. Dev certainly is a very, very lonely character, and Nikki, the other main character, she lives in the town, and she lives a very ostensibly quite social life. She's very self-sufficient. She works. She drives around her useless boyfriend and his mother, and she just is assigned the job of kind of taking care of people, as well as herself. But she's also a very lonely character. So I mean, you kind of just use that. The sort of Ireland felt very remote to me, and I mean, the pandemic brought its own energy to it. So isolation and that whole sort of space you had to inhabit, you can always, if these things don't overwhelm you, you can always use them in a productive way in your writing. So I mean, it ended up feeding into it, and definitely made it. It gave it a tenor that maybe it wouldn't have had otherwise. It's interesting. Well, it's not that interesting because I don't think about it. But if I was here, if the pandemic hadn't happened, it would be. It may have. Of course, it would have ended up a different book with a different tone, even if it was the same premise. But it fed into it, and I used it as well as I could. Yeah.
Thank you, Estelle. You were really writing about where you live now, though. You live in the Liberties, and this novel is of the Liberties. What was that like?
Well, it was handier than being in Canada. Most of the time was during the pandemic time, although it had been started long before that, and started even long before that in my head. But you need to be, when it's so dialogue heavy and dialect heavy, and the language is so important, and the kind of the registers that people have, and what is okay to say to certain people is not okay to say to other people, and that everybody actually knows what is and isn't okay, and it makes you be part of an in-group if you can say it. If you say those words, you're part of that in-group. Words that would be, rationally speaking, offensive, that you would say to each other. Like, young men are very brutal with each other. It would seem so from the outside, but it's actually a way of saying we're part of this, we're in this together kind of thing. So it was very important to be living there, but I've been living there for a long time. Like, I've raised my family there, I had all 4 of them in the coombe round the corner, and I could walk round to the coombe to have them, so I'm that close to it. So it's just a fantastic place to live, and people say it's a multicultural novel, and as I said before, that is a handy word, multicultural, but it isn't really multicultural. It's just all Dublin culture. That's what it is, Just because there are people in it whose families came from other places, it's really a melting pot. And the Liberties in particular, and historically, that's what, the Huguenots took refuge there. They brought the weaving industry to it. Persecuted people have gone to there because it was always a bit wild. It was always a bit mad, and it still is a bit mad. I was thinking one day, I was walking down the road, and it was before the book launch, and I was going, are people going to think, that I'm exaggerating, that this is paddy whackery, And there's that was never my intention, And I was thinking, the horse on the lead, a fella goes down with a miniature pony, and he ties it up outside the shop. But that was a person who did that, like a middle-aged man who had a miniature pony, and he'd take it to Centra and tie it up outside where he'd go in for his fags, So. And as I was walking down, I was getting my nails done, actually, for the launch. And as I was walking down to the place, 2 men, adult men, came out of the road around there by School Street with their miniature ponies on ropes, leading them like dogs. Not with harnesses now, and that rope around their leg, like a neck, collar on them, leading them down the road. So I was going, no, I didn't do anything wrong here.
these are two first novels, but in a sense, I mean, in a very real sense, neither of you are at all inexperienced writers. You know, you're not arriving, you know, with your novel and no previous experience or reputation. Colin, you've published 2 collections of short stories, brilliant collections. Published a number of short stories in The New Yorker and elsewhere. Estelle, you've written a lot of short stories in journalism, and yet, was there? I'll start with Estelle and ask, what was the difference between doing that kind of writing and doing something like a novel? Which, as I tell my students, you know, you're not going to do this in a year. You're not going to do this in 6 months. You're not going to do it in 2 years. You know, you buckle in for the long haul. What was that? What was that like?
It's very daunting. You think, because I review books as well, because I'm a book critic, you know, and I know how difficult it must be, but actually when you started, the first 3 chapters were, I was doing the MA in UCD in creative writing, so the first three chapters were my thesis. So that was grand. And that seemed long. But then how do you go any further? I froze so many times. And if I hadn't had such a brilliant editor, Colin Barrett, who knew exactly how to manage me and my procrastination and stuff, and just let me off, but occasionally gave me a bit of the fear, I wouldn't have got it done. Like it's really, and I'd go off on flights of fancy. Like this was way longer, and it's long enough now, you know. But like it was way longer, and it's just. Took me years, you know. I was sitting there, you hear people who do actually do it in a year, and they're very competent writers, you know. They're books you want to read. I have no idea how they do that. None. Like I sat looking at a blank wall for weeks probably, you know, just sitting there thinking about it, walking along the canal, talking to myself, a lot of the time out loud. Like, you know, I know there's probably people here who have actually seen me doing that along the towpath, because there were a lot of people who I'd suddenly realise I'd be walking along and I'd suddenly realise from the expression on the oncoming person's face that they were laughing at me, you know. So it's just, I don't know. You took a long time to write your own second novel.
This all sounds totally normal to me.
Yeah.
You know, this sounds like a normal way to write
Yeah.
a novel, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah,
So.
yeah, absolutely. Colin, how did it feel moving from the? This is a kind of silly question because they're totally different forms. One doesn't move from the short story to the novel, really. It doesn't really work that way. And yet, because a novel is not just a long short story. That's not what it is. But it nonetheless, it requires different resources, I think, of kind of doggedness, persistence. How did you kind of go about that?
Yeah, I mean, much of what Estelle said resonated. It's you know, you kind of have an idea in the abstract. It's going to take a long time. I always had the premise. I always had the character of Dev, especially, and the premise, which is what is now the opening chapter, where he's at home and his cousins, the Birdy brothers, bring this boy to his door. And I mean, I would have had the same thing where I would get stuck and, you know, wouldn't know where to go and would put it aside for however long and maybe write a story or do whatever, stare at the wall. That's all completely legitimate, staring at the wall and going on walks and not writing. That's when the unconscious does its work. So, you know, I've really made my peace with that, and it's all just a part of it. But yeah, I mean, it was kind of stop, start, and whatnot, which kind of is it's just how I write in general. I write very slowly and incrementally, and then I go back over stuff over and over again. But with a short story, you know, if a short story is 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 words, you know, no matter how difficult it is, no matter how long single short stories have taken me well over a year to write, you know, off and on. But you know, if you've a 3,500, 4,000 word document, there's as someone writing it, there's the possibility of redemption in one afternoon. Yeah. You can open that document. You know, you've had a story sitting there for 6 months. You like it. Dennis Johnson said he took 25 years to write The Largesse of the Sea Maiden title story in his last collection, and I can believe it. But it's in the drawer. You take it out. It's 10 pages. I've got a free Friday afternoon. Let's open it up and see what happens. And I'm getting excited. But you can't do that with a novel because there's too much at any one point. Even when you've got a little bit, 15,000 words of it, that's still a lot, you know. Yeah. And it's only maybe a tenth of it or half it, or a quarter of it. So you have to work on it piece by piece. Yeah, a lot of trial and error. The key for me with Wild Houses was I did get a first edit, which Estelle said it was much longer than this, so you end up with a huge amount of material that there's no point feeling, is it good or bad? It's just, is it pertinent or not? Does it fit or not? So I did a big structural rejig in my second draft, and that's where I found the logic of the shape of the book. And then it still took a year and a half to do that edit, but I understood what I would be leaving in and leaving out. And so that was the key for me, but that was after 3 or 4 years of writing the first draft. So, you know, and that's, as you said, that's just how it can be sometimes, you know.
We are unfortunately out of time. It remains for me only to say, go and read these two brilliant books, and thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to Colin and Estelle. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.